Hi, I'm John Byrne with Poets and Quants. Welcome to our little Q&A session here on the new ranking from Bloomberg Businessweek. This is the 18th ranking that Businessweek has published. I know it well because back in 1988, this is a dubious distinction to be sure, but I actually created this ranking. It's changed over time and changed rather considerably in the last few years. But it's still well followed, and it still has some clout. And when I talk about clout, what I mean is rankings do affect application volume, they affect alumni contributions, they can even impact the recruitment of faculty. So what's the big news in today's ranking? Well, Harvard is at the top, third time in a row, and that's not really news because it's a repeat performance. I think the real big news is Wharton and MIT. Both schools moved up 4 places. Wharton is now second, and MIT Sloan is third. The more interesting story, I think, is Wharton because in every one of the 5 major rankings that were published this year, Wharton made gains. In the U.S. News ranking, which is probably the most important rank in the United States and the most closely followed, Wharton tied Harvard Business School for first place. Wharton also came in first in the Forbes ranking. In this ranking, as I pointed out, Wharton climbed 4 spots. In the FT, it climbed 1, and in the Economist ranking, it climbed 8 spots to actually end up ranked 4th in the Economist ranking. So you add that all together, it's 21 places of improvement in a single year for Wharton, which is a big story. Obviously, up and down the list are a lot of different surprises. There are schools that go way down. One of them is George Washington University, which plunged 14 places this year. Another very positive story is Penn State Smeal, which has rarely, if ever, been called a top 25 school. It just edged its way into the top 25, climbing 12 places this year. And you'll find a whole bunch of other stories. Texas A&M was down 4 spots to 22. Stanford and Berkeley Haas, the 2 great West Coast schools other than UCLA and USC, both down 3 spots. Stanford is now 5th. Behind Harvard, Wharton, MIT, and Chicago's Booth. Haas is down to 11th out of the top 10, down 3. How seriously should you take this stuff? Not very seriously. This is more about entertainment value, I think, than anything else. And let's talk a little bit about why that's so. First off, you have some really peculiar finishes in this ranking. You have schools that you would never imagine that would perform as well as they did. One good example, Rice University's Jones School. They were number 8th last year, which was a shocker. This year they lost 2 spots. They're now number 10, but that's still a shocker because very few people will put Rice University in the top 10. They have a new dean. It's a great MBA program. I'm not underselling it, but there are a lot of programs underneath it that have more resources, more clout, stronger alumni networks, are more selective, and you would certainly expect them to be above Rice. When you take apart the pieces of this ranking, this is where you really get to see the really cool stuff and the crazy stuff. Let me give you a good example. How about the recruiter survey? So, there are 5 different elements in the methodology that Businessweek currently uses to rank schools. One of them is a survey to corporate recruiters who recruit MBAs. This is the one element of the survey that's ranked the most, meaning it has the most weight in the methodology. It's 35% of the entire ranking. Now, when you look at the recruiter ranking, what you really discover are some really peculiar things. Guess where Stanford is in the recruiter ranking? 20. Guess who's ahead of Stanford? Syracuse, Purdue, Penn State, Texas A&M. Doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense because Stanford MBAs make the most money. So if corporate recruiters are willing to pay Stanford MBAs more money to hire them than any other school in the world, how in the world could they rank 20th in the recruiter survey? I'll tell you why. Because what Businessweek does is it goes to each school and it gets the name of every single recruiter who happened to go on campus in the past year. Many of those people are alumni of the schools that they recruited from. So you have this unusual situation where you have alumni ranking essentially their alma mater. So that really skews the results. Businessweek does make a small correction for that. There are like 2 elements to the recruiter ranking score, but for half of the score, those alumni recruiters are included, and it does color the results. You might say, how could Syracuse rank higher than Stanford in the recruiter survey? But, Syracuse's program is relatively small, but it must have an incredible fan base where a recruiter who's an alum who goes to Stanford probably has enough confidence in the institution that person may not even fill out the survey. So that's one of the problems. You have also then another component which is sort of interesting. It's an alumni survey. What Businessweek does is it goes back to alumni from 2008 to 2010, and it asks them about their education, how well it stood up through the test of time and in the workplace. And if you look under the hood of this survey as well, which counts for 30% of the ranking, you'll also find some really quirky results that often result from cheerleading of alums of certain programs. It also results from small sample sizes. So there are a lot of things in there that can go wrong and that are inherently flawed. Third component of this is a student survey. That has less weight than it used to have. It only has a 15% weight. The student survey is of the class of 2017. And then there are 2 final elements, 10% for placement 3 months after graduation and 10% for salary. When you look at a ranking, one of the actual best things to do is to really take it apart and look at what the different pieces are. And one of the really cool things is the wealth of data that any ranking organization collects and then delivers to the public. And some of the most interesting data that I found on the Businessweek ranking this year has to do with how much money people were making before they went to business school, how much they made when they graduated, which is a commonly known number and no big deal there, but then also what the alumni are making from 2007 and 2010. Big surprise for me was who were the best paid MBA students before they went to business school. You won't guess. You're gonna think, okay, it's got to be Harvard, it's got to be Stanford, it's got to be Wharton, it's got to be Columbia, right? Columbia because it's in New York and it's a very elite school. Harvard, Stanford, Wharton for all the obvious reasons. No, it happens to be, according to Businessweek at least, and their surveys, UC Berkeley Haas. The average student had a median income at UC Berkeley Haas before going to the school of, let me look it up, $86,250. That's a lot of cash for a 27, 28-year-old kid. Sure, Harvard and Stanford and Wharton all were at 85. But it was a real surprise for me to see Berkeley at 86,250. It also a surprise to see what alumni are making from Berkeley and other schools from that class of 2008 through 2010. The median income is $260,000 at Berkeley, over $250,000 a year. The high end is Harvard, according to Businessweek. $280,000 a year. Wharton was $262,500, and Stanford was $255,000. So all in all, some really interesting results. What happens now, of course, is there's analysis to be done. Some schools will freak out because they didn't do as well as they should have, and they will scour the data and see where they might be able to improve. Other schools will be sending out press releases, tooting their horn for getting a better ranking. And in a couple of weeks, Poets and Quants will now put together its composite ranking. Now that the 5 most important rankings have basically come out, what we do every year is we mash them together. We weight them according to what I believe to be their credibility, and we come out with a ranking that I would call an Uber ranking, because in one place you can see where all the schools ranked on every major survey of the year, but you can also see how that all fits together and what it means. And when you do that, what happens is it kind of diminishes the anomalies in any given ranking in any given year, and you come, I think, to some greater truth about where these schools really rank and where they stand. Now, if any of you out there have some questions, I'm happy to answer them. What do you say? We have Sat here who's going to relay the questions from the audience today.
So we have a question about Wisconsin shutting down its full-time program. What's the deal with Wisconsin shutting down its full-time program?
Okay, here's what I think the deal is. Wisconsin was losing money on the program, probably $1.5 to $2 million a year, according to my sources. But you know, Wisconsin is ranked 34th by U.S. News, ranked lower down by Businessweek. I can't remember exactly. You have to look up the story on Poets and Quants. But in other words, it's a top program. It's in the 1% of the food chain of MBA programs. The results for the graduates are sensational. Median compensation, rather median salary, starting salary is $100,000. The average bonuses are like over $22,000 for sign-on bonuses. The school has a great reputation, has an innovative MBA program. What happened is a new dean came in and saw the losses, and out of discussions with the faculty, decided she was going to try to shut it down. Big problem, because number one, Wisconsin is a school that has remarkable support from its alumni. Number one, the school isn't named because actually the alums donated $85 million not to name the school years ago, and that gift has actually ballooned to $110 million. There are few schools that can claim that kind of incredible support from alums. And what happened is this new dean, who was in the job 2.5 months, and who came from the outside, wasn't totally familiar with the culture or the stakeholders at the school, made this move. I think she regrets it dearly, because there are lots of other things you can cut. Executive education, it turns out, at Wisconsin isn't doing all that well. And in the search for a dean, that was the thing that came up more often than not that needed to be fixed. Wisconsin has a PhD program. Everyone in the PhD program goes for free. It's a full ride with a living stipend. Wisconsin is probably losing $5 to $7 million on the PhD program. So there are plenty of other things to cut. And more than that, there was an opportunity to go back to alumni and say, hey, we've got a problem with our MBA program. Can you help us out? And I guarantee you that the alumni would have done so. Instead, that didn't happen. There was a big uproar. Obviously, the dean changed her mind. But now you had all this widespread publicity about the potential close of the program, and the impact of that on the applicant pool this year will probably be a disaster. So whether or not, it's kind of like Obamacare, right? Trump discourages people from signing up, and then you have sort of more evidence that there's trouble there, and maybe more of an opportunity to say, okay, I'm going to shut it down. Same thing here. Those public actions are going to result in a decline in applicant quality and applicant volume. And unless Wisconsin wants to ride that out, they'll have more evidence, more reason to probably shut the MBA program down in the future.
You have another question looking for your thoughts on the Simon MBA.
I am bullish on Rochester Simon. I'll tell you why. The new dean at the school, who had run the MBA program at UCLA Anderson, is a brilliant tactician. He really knows the inner game of business schools, and I think he's doing some really interesting things at Rochester to turn that program around. You know, when I first got started back in 1988 with the ranking, Rochester was solidly in the top 25, and that was one of the first business schools I ever visited in my life. And I was remarkably impressed with what that school was doing. It fell in little hard times. We know that things in Rochester are really difficult. Eastman Kodak, Xerox, Bausch & Lomb, all three major employers in Rochester that have basically hit the skids or left. And that has hurt the school, no doubt. But I have a really good feeling about Andrew Ansley, who is the dean, and his ability to turn this thing over. So I'm pretty bullish on Rochester Simon. And his strategy, incidentally, has a lot to do with student quality. You know, in the whole business school MBA game, there's been an overemphasis on GMAT scores. High GMAT scores do not correlate to anything other than one's ability to complete the core curriculum successfully. And even that correlation is not as strong as a lot of people think it is. There's no correlation with career success, no correlation with IQ, and certainly no correlation with EQ. And many people actually think that you sacrifice EQ, which is more important for business success, when you take high GMAT scores. Andrew is going to take a short-term hit on GMAT because he wants better candidates, and he's not going to fight over high GMAT scores for the sake of a U.S. News ranking initially. And he thinks those better students that he's going to get in that program are going to impress the recruiters. And there's going to be a virtuous circle that allows him to push up the GMAT scores more naturally later on. I think that's a brilliant idea.
Okay, we have another question specific to rankings again. Can you talk about the challenges of ranking surveys from recruiters and alums when the size of programs and thus the sample size vary so much?
Yeah, I mean, that's really a big problem because even though organizations do have certain percentages that they're looking for in terms of response rates, if you have a school that is graduating 60 or fewer than 100 students a year, and you do a student survey on them compared to a school that graduates 930 people a year like Harvard, you're going to get very different results. Incidentally, with a smaller group, it's more likely that you can influence the result than with a larger group. Larger groups tend to have more outliers, meaning negative outliers primarily. And one negative person in a ranking survey could really cancel out 10 or more of the cheerleaders. Ultimately, you have this problem that does exist. Some people will say, okay, it cancels itself out across the surveys. And the problem is this. You are invested in a given program. You get this survey from Businessweek, and how you fill it out determines how your school is going to rank. Now, do you really think you want your school to rank lowly so that when your degree is put on a resume and it's sent to an employer, it has less value than it otherwise might because it's ranked lower? Probably not. So there's a good deal of cheerleading that's going on in all these surveys. And the smaller the sample size, the bigger the problem, frankly. And because the sample sizes are not the same across the entire survey, I think that can lead to sort of flaws and misreadings as well. The recruiter thing I mentioned earlier, and it's a problem that basically Businessweek now surveys all the recruiters. You know, back in the day, what Businessweek did was really smart. And Businessweek was the only one that did it. They did a lot of upfront due diligence on the corporate recruiter survey, which meant this. They went to a company, they went to a major division that hired MBAs, and they asked for the leading person who was in charge of the MBA recruiting effort. And they asked that person in one company, not who was an alum, but who oversees all of the MBA recruiting in the company, to give his or her opinion about the track record of their MBA hires in the company. And that was what was done. And basically, if you had 260 responses, you had a great response rate because you did all the pre-work to make sure the right people were answering. And incidentally, the other important thing about this is to make sure that someone even has a basis for comparison. Most of the people filling out the Businessweek survey today have no basis of comparison. So what they do is, you're a Stanford alum, or better yet, you're a Rice alum, and you only go back to Rice to recruit its students. You haven't recruited students at any of its rival schools, that therefore you really don't even have the wherewithal to make judgments about those other candidates. And that is one of the really big problems with the Businessweek survey. That is also a problem with the U.S. News survey, which also collects data from corporate recruiters as well.
Okay, we have somebody asking, does rank really matter? Shouldn't what you've learned be the only thing that should really matter?
Okay, I totally agree with that. Really? Even though I created this monster back in 1988, and I admit it's totally out of control, I have to tell you that what you learn really is what matters, because more often than not, programs are, forget the rankings for a moment. Most people are looking at ROI. What's your return on your investment, and how much money are you going to make when you get out of the program? And that's the wrong way to look at it, because the right way to look at it is, will you have a career that's more meaningful and more fulfilling to you throughout your life? And will that MBA degree and what you've learned in the program give that to you? Will you have the job you really want as opposed to the job that you got? And does that really matter to you? I think it does. And I actually think that those two things, getting the job you really want and having a fulfilling career for the rest of your life where you're learning and you're growing and you're developing and you really love what you're doing, those are the more important takeaways from a really good MBA program. Why is rank still important? Because I do think it's helpful to know more or less where these schools stand. And while I think that any one ranking isn't going to give you absolute truth, I think putting them all together, particularly over time, it gets you to really where they are. And used to be, and here's one of the reasons why I started the ranking. Number one, back in the late 80s, business schools were pretty arrogant and pretty self-satisfied. For years, the companies were complaining about the product. They thought MBAs had great technical skills and great analytical skills, but had horrible soft skills. And this was back in the day in the 80s when very little attention was paid to leadership development, to communication skills, to presentations, to that kind of thing, and working in teams and collaboration. But the schools never changed. One of the things I wanted to do is to ask the companies and ask the graduates to basically rate their education. Back then, when I surveyed graduates, none of them knew there would be a ranking. So the answers we got were really truthful as opposed to what they are today. So I think, rankings have forced schools to change, and more often than not change for the better. There's been a lot of innovation in business school curricula because of rankings, because it creates a much more competitive and dynamic marketplace where the schools are competing against each other and trying to do better and better every year. So there is a positive impact from rankings. Here's the other thing about rankings. The fact that 5 major business media brands, The Economist, the Financial Times, Forbes, Businessweek, U.S. News, all rank business schools means that it's front and center, that it captures a tremendous amount of mind share. People are reminded that there is value here every time these schools are ranked, no matter where they're ranked, up or down, or whether your school is ranked or not. And that has really convinced a lot of people to go for this degree, which I really think is one of the best graduate degrees you could get.
I have a student that is wondering whether an elite MBA is the right thing given their background. As a former soccer player, an undergraduate degree from Brazil, started 2 companies, looking to apply next year with indicated an average GPA and is looking at elite schools?
They would love you. First off, elite schools love athletes. The research shows that people who were involved in team sports at the collegiate level even are among the best candidates that a business school could get. And if in fact you were playing professional soccer, they would really love you. There are a lot of baseball players, football players, basketball players, soccer players who are in business school. And one thing that it does is it immediately takes you out of the pile, right? It makes you are not in the mainstream of the applicant pool. You're not an investment banker, you're not a product manager in a tech firm, you're not a consultant. And so suddenly you're in a new pool and there aren't many people in it. So you're going to get an extra hard look and they're going to really like you. And the fact that you actually started 2 companies is another plus on your application. So I would encourage you to go for the best school you can get into. I think you have a really good shot. I don't know your GMAT or your GRE. That has some impact. I don't know what your GPA is or where you graduated with your undergraduate degree. But if you're a professional soccer player, you started 2 companies, you're from Brazil, go for it. You are a good candidate in general for an M7 school as long as your GPA and your GMAT are sort of in the range.
I have an interesting question about Darden. I have someone who said they heard that Darden is hurting in the application volume due to the events in Charlottesville this past summer. A, is that true? And B, do you think that means that there's a higher chance of acceptance due to a smaller application pool?
I think Darden is like an undervalued stock right now. I mean, if I were Jim Cramer, I'd be, ringing the bell and shouting from the rooftops, apply to Darden. Darden is one of the best MBA experiences in the world, bar none. It has the best MBA teaching faculty in the world, better than Harvard, better than Tuck, better than most of the other schools that we would think would have great faculty. The Darden faculty is second to none in the world. Round 1 was not good at Darden. It was not good because, a lot of international candidates read the headlines. They really don't know about American culture and how that protest was little more than an aberration in what is a beautiful, fantastic town, Charlottesville, Virginia. And so they crossed Darden off the list. There are underrepresented minorities and women, perhaps, that also decided not to apply there. My advice, Darden, go for it. Like I said, you don't want to buy a stock when it's high. You want to buy a stock when it's low, and it's going to go back up. And I think Darden is one of the better schools in the world to get an MBA education from. As you know, it's a case study school. After Harvard, it's the most well-known case study school in America. And has a new dean, a senior partner from McKinsey, who's got some great ideas, a very dynamic guy who's going to do really sensational things at the school. And they just hired back the old admissions director, Donna Clark, who had been admissions head over at the Dartmouth Tuck School for many years. And she is thinking of really new, cool ways to evaluate people. And I expect them to come out with some sort of announcement in the foreseeable future about how they're going to change the game. If you're interested in Darden, I think your chances are better than they have been. It's a highly selective school. But given the fact that some people don't understand how to read what happened in Charlottesville, I think Darden is going to take a little bit of a hit throughout the year. And it could even linger to a second year. At least this is what the dean believes. But that is really one of the premier MBA experiences in the world. If I were 27, I'd be putting an application in Darden right now.
Your thoughts on the Hopkins program?
Okay, I love the Hopkins program. I was among the first journalists to write about it. It's really unusual. Interestingly enough, that is the other program that has a dean from McKinsey, Very dynamic guy and a very funny character. Right from the start, Johns Hopkins wanted to do something completely different, and they did. There's a lot of social impact stuff in that program, and it is different. It's still relatively new, so you have what you would typically have with a relatively new program: a small alumni base, younger faculty who are less likely to be published in the scholarly journals, at least compared to some of their peer schools. It is also one of the newest schools of status to enter the MBA market. I'm pretty high on Johns Hopkins. I think Baltimore is a fantastic city to get an education in. You're right outside Washington, D.C., and not very far from New York and Philadelphia. So I like Johns Hopkins a lot. Okay, do we have anything else?
I think that's it. You do have a hello from Kansas.
Well, hello, Kansas. I love your new school. We were out there a little over a year ago, and we met your former dean, who's now your provost, who's one of the most dynamic and smartest people in academia today. Fantastic building, and really dedicated staff, wonderful students. We also interviewed a bunch of the alums who've done really well, including people who've gone on to Facebook and in senior positions at some of the banks. So, hi, Kansas. All right, hey, listen, thanks for joining me. We'll archive this on our Facebook page. Hope you enjoyed our conversation and my rundown. Come to the site, take a look at the analysis we published today on the Businessweek ranking. I will be also doing another piece on the 10 most interesting or most unusual things about this ranking, as I did last year. Hope to crank that out for tomorrow. Otherwise, thanks for joining us. I'm John Byrne with Poets and Quants in Oakland, California, our company headquarters.